I'm here to introduce our lunch speaker, who really, let's be honest, right, kind of doesn't need any introduction. I do have the new book, Nimitz at War. I figured we'd show off for everybody. You know, I say he needs no introduction, but I will make one small comment of introduction. In 1991, when Harrison Ford was trying to figure out how he was going to play being a naval historian who teaches at the Naval Academy, there was one professor that he followed around to get the method. We didn't have the big screen here today, or else I would have drawn up the photograph that Sam found in special collections of Harrison Ford serving our speaker today a cup of coffee in the chair's office in the history department. But it was Professor Craig Symonds who he followed around to see what it was like to be a naval historian. So I can think of no better introduction for someone.
Jeez.
And they're bona fides as one of the deans of our field as that. So without further ado, Dr. Symonds.
All right. Thank you, BJ, I think, for that introduction. Quick story about Harrison Ford being in my classroom. You know, midshipmen and students everywhere are creatures of habit. When they come in the first day and they pick a seat, that's their seat. So that when a midshipman came in late, knocked, "Permission to come aboard, sir." "Yeah, come on in and sit down." He walked to the back row. "There's someone in his seat." And he said to this gentleman, "Sir, you're in my seat." And Harrison Ford said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and got up and stood in the back of the room. This fellow sat down, class continued, and then afterward, after Ford left, the entire classroom turned on this kid and said, "Are you nuts? You made Harrison Ford get out of your seat." And he said, "Who? What? Really? No. Can't be true." You know, I have some remarks here, and I'm going to probably stick pretty close to them, but I found it interesting how many of the things I wanted to say at lunch today have already been talked about in our first two sessions, and I'm sure that more will be covered this afternoon. But because we're all forgetful in our advancing age, I'm going to go over some of them anyway. I'm happy to be here to talk to this group, naval historians, teachers of naval history. Teaching naval history to midshipmen is the best job in America, period. I've always said so. I still think so. I taught naval history here for 30 years. There were a couple of semesters when I taught other things. There were a couple of semesters when I was on sabbatical, but I calculated coming in here that I probably taught this course about 150 times. That's 150 sections of naval history. I found it interesting that Bill Trimble talked this morning about how he does a global world naval history course, or did for many years. And during my first couple of semesters here, my first couple of years here, that's what we did. We taught a required 2-semester naval history course from triremes to tomorrow in 2 semesters. But it's kind of interesting how we broke that down. The first semester went from the Battle of Salamis to 1920. And then the second semester was 1920 to about 1960, 40 years or so. The book, of course, was the original Seapower, the big fat one, edited by E.B. Potter, Ned Potter, with whom I shared an office when I first arrived here in 1976, and of course co-edited by Chester Nimitz, that guy, which all the students and the faculty too, for that matter, all called Potter Nimitz, as if that were a single word. A few copies of that are still around. It's a good read if you want to go into the details of the naval history prior to 1920 in particular. So the 2-semester course that we taught was a little skewed, shall we say, in favor of the modern era. We probably spent as much time on the 5 minutes between 10:25 and 10:30 on June 4th, 1942, as we did on the 1,000 years from 500 to 1500. So in my third year here at the Academy, we addressed this imbalance. We were concerned that by spending 2 semesters on naval history and very much combat naval history, operational naval history, we didn't spend time on the world in which our young men and women were going to serve. Nothing on Western Civ. So after a lot of discussion, I mean, of course there was a lot of discussion, it's an academic group, we decided to cut the naval history course back to a single semester and do just American naval history so that we had another semester to devote to Western civilization. Now, the good news about that is we got to cover Western civilization. That's great. Now I understand world civilization. Even better. The downside of that is that we began roughly in 1775. So we miss a lot of the context and the world out of which the United States and the United States Navy as an institution grew. So goodbye triremes, Salamis, Lepanto, the Spanish Armada, the Anglo-Dutch Wars, Ginny. Goodbye, all gone. There's also another way in which, particularly toward the end of my 30-year teaching tour here, that I found it rather awkward to be teaching a constricted naval history course that covered just American naval history. It covers about 220 years, roughly, 1775 to the present, and I realized on the cusp of my retirement I'd lived through most of that, not most of that, I'm not quite that old, but I'd lived through about 30% of that. David Rosenberg talked to us this morning about history since 1945. That's my lifetime. So what seemed to me to be current events, things I actually remembered, things that I assumed were within the conversational grouping of what people of my age would know about, I was teaching to young people for whom that was ancient history. I could give lots of examples of that. You've run into them yourself, I'm sure, many times. I'm sorry, what was that device you referred to? A stapler? I don't know what that is. And for many of them, I learned there were 2 time periods. There's now, and there's stuff that happened before now, all of which is kind of in one general area, so that George Washington and Ronald Reagan are roughly contemporaries. Given Reagan's age, maybe that was even true. Joe Biden, too, for that matter. And I suspect that one reason there was a lack of historical awareness among my students was that a lot of them had come through a high school program where they took advanced classes, where narrative history, old-fashioned fact after fact and name after name, that's not for advanced students. We want to be analytical, we want to be interpretive, we want to understand what's going on. A smart student can always look up facts. So rather than waste time learning facts, they spent that valuable time on analysis and interpretation. Well, that's not a bad thing. But it does have an unfortunate side effect. And that is that by passing a lot of the mundane, chronological, narrative, factual-based history, they didn't get the this happened, then this happened, the cause and effect relationship among those things that often constituted the thread of what many of us had, or at least what I had, when we were in high school. And it's hard to do serious analysis and interpretation if you lack a narrative or factual context out of which those things develop. So that's my first recommendation. I have three, no, that's 2. I have 3 recommendations today, and here's the first one. I can boil it down to one word, and that is context. Do not underestimate the depth of your students' ignorance about the past. You cannot assume that they know, randomly, who was the President of the United States during the War of 1812, or that there was a War of 1812. I was amused by Nick Lambert's comments about the War of 1812 today. It reminded me, Nick, of when I was teaching at Dartmouth at the British Naval Academy, and I had occasion to be talking about the Napoleonic Wars and mentioned the War of 1812 in passing. The student raised his hand. He says, "Sir, you mentioned the War of 1812. What was that?" And so he needed a little context, so I gave it to him. I explained what the War of 1812 was, and he rather quizzically said, "You were in that war too." So keep in mind that many of them may lack the context, making an assumption that you can introduce an idea about naval history, and even naval history and economic history, even naval history and social cultural history, absent the context of stuff that happened. So I'm not sure the best way to plumb the depth of that, but one way is through conversation back and forth. Mention a concept. You know what that is? Maybe not. For example, in talking about the American Revolution, it's important for them to understand there had been a global competition between Britain and France that had been going on since 1689. And absent understanding of that European conflict, why are the Americans trying to get the French? Why are they successful in getting the French to participate in the war in our behalf? So, context, I think, is critical of all of American wars. And I don't necessarily mean you have to make them memorize lists of names. Who are the presidents? What are the wars? But it does help to provide them with an historical framework in which to embed ideas about naval and maritime history. So, context, that's the first one. Here's my second one, and that is personalities. We had some conversation about that this morning too. Students everywhere, and this certainly includes midshipmen here, but I imagine students at just about any university, I can identify with individuals if there's a three-dimensional personality they can understand. Who that person was, where they came from, the circumstances they confronted at an historical moment, and how they confronted it, and why they confronted it the way they did. If you can put your students into the shoes of some of those decision makers, it's a way of getting a kind of artificial experience for them. History is valuable, and we all know why, and we talked a lot of it about this morning, but certainly one way is that it expands dramatically your own sense of the place of yourself and your culture in the wider world if you can put yourself in the shoes of historical actors. Heroic moments that we teach in history, especially those that make it into reef points. For those of you who are not Naval Academy oriented, reef points is the little book of gouge that all brand new plebes are handed on I-Day, that they sit and memorize little pieces of often arcane information, but also bits of naval history. That's where they learn that John Paul Jones hollered back, "I have not yet begun to fight," or Farragut said, "Damn the torpedoes," or apparently something very like it. But our job, of course, is to go beyond reef points. More background brings those moments into focus. For example, the British considered Jones to be a pirate when he's on the Bonhomme Richard. Captured alive, he probably would have been hanged. In fighting the Serapis, he discovered that his lower deck guns were not reliable. One of them exploded in the first or second broadside. Sailors wouldn't go near him anymore. So now he's being hammered to pieces by a much larger ship with heavier ordnance. His rigging is cut to pieces. His ship is taking on water. He was overmatched and all but sinking. But when asked if he was going to surrender, hell no, right? And that's good. It's in reef points. But at what point is it the responsible thing to do to save the lives of your men? rather than have them all go down to the ship because you don't want to be hanged by the British. Well, that all worked out. We know that now. But if you can put your students in that moment, invite them to consider what they would have done. You don't necessarily have to make them stand up and say it, but invite them to think silently to themselves, how might I have reacted under those circumstances? I have a friend many of you know named Tom Cutler, who was my XA when I was department chairman in the history department, Tom's job, and who now works at the Naval Institute. He had, or for all I know, still has a kind of mantra, an icon that he uses to help him in decision making. WWDD. What would Decatur do? The reference, of course, is Stephen Decatur, who became a Navy captain at the age of 25, still the youngest ever to attain that rank, who boldly took a volunteer crew into Algiers Harbor to burn the Philadelphia during the Barbary Wars. But then, in the War of 1812, he also surrendered the frigate United States to overwhelming odds when he saw there was nothing to be gained by going down with the ship. He was done fighting. I mentioned Farragut, his damming of the torpedoes at Mobile Bay, probably the second most famous naval aphorism in Reef Points, equally as defiant as Jones. Context is helpful here too. At the moment, his ship Hartford was in a ship channel, a very narrow ship channel entering into Mobile Bay, without the ability to reverse or change course. He's in a line ahead formation. He's now the lead ship after the Brooklyn has gone down. I guess he might have said, you know, there's really no place else for us to go here. We might as well just keep going straight because I can't go right or left and I can't turn around, so. But of course he said, damn the torpedoes. 4 bells, Captain Drayton. Often rendered as full speed ahead. I often make a cheap joke out of this by saying when told there were torpedoes in the water ahead, he said, damn the torpedoes. Boldness is often admirable. It's always admirable in Reef Points, but it's not always the school solution. You might ask your students, for example, to decide who was a better commander during World War II, Bull Halsey or Raymond Spruance. Now, this is especially useful in comparing the decisions that each of them made in the battles of the Philippine Sea for Spruance and Leyte Gulf for Halsey. One was prudent, one might say conservative, one was utterly audacious. Now, Napoleon is often quoted as saying audacity is key in warfare. A commander's most desirable trait, l'audace, toujours l'audace. Well, Halsey certainly lived up to that, but we can all think of moments when audacity is not the right answer. Charge of the Light Brigade, Pickett's charge, Halsey at Leyte Gulf, maybe. So prudence and audacity have to be balanced. And so I would invite the students to consider that. For example, after World War II, Congress authorized 4 men in the Army, 4 men in the Navy to attain the rank of 5-star commander, General of the Army, Fleet Admiral. Leahy, King, Nimitz, each got a 5th star. Well, we got room for 1 more. And it came down to Halsey or Spruance. Ask them, who should have gotten it? Why? And who did? Who did, by the way? Halsey did, yeah. All right, context, personalities. Here's one more. Geography. I had a friend in the history department, many of you will remember him, I'm sure, named Bob Artigiani, great colleague. And we were talking one day about teaching, and I mentioned to him that I frequently gave map quizzes to my students in the Naval History course so that they would actually know where things are in the world. Bob quietly removed his pipe from his mouth, solemnly told me that geography is about maps. History is about chaps. Okay. That's why I guess I put personalities ahead of geography, but I'm still going to insist that it is absolutely critical that students of naval history know where they are, where things are in the world. I suspect you would be surprised, if not in fact shocked, to discover what your students don't know about global geography. Some of you have probably seen the bits that Jay Leno used to do on his show when he was hosting The Tonight Show. He would go out in the street and ask people questions of what we assume is common knowledge to assess the depth of ignorance among American citizens. He called it jaywalking. He often asked about geography. Now, I don't dispute that he probably cherry-picked the responses so he could get the funnier ones on TV. It's even possible that people feigned ignorance so they could get on TV. I don't know. But here are American citizens, college graduates in many cases, college students, who could not find Europe on a map, or Africa, or the United States. Now, these are extreme examples. But our midshipmen, your students, are not exempt from it. So I challenge you to give them a map quiz sometime in the first week, just to find out, a kind of diagnostic. Ask them to find some of the usual suspects. Do they know where the Caribbean Sea is, the Chesapeake Bay, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Ocean, maybe the Black Sea, where there's a naval war taking place right now as we speak? Can they find the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, Straits of Malacca, the Taiwan Straits, where we might have to fight a naval war in our lifetime? Maybe students today are more informed about geography than they were 20 years ago, but I'm skeptical. One culprit is the internet. As I mentioned in discussing context, I think a lot of secondary school teachers assume that it's not really necessary to teach things like geography anymore because you can look it up. There's nothing to it. I can find anything I want. All I have to do is take a look at my phone. Fair enough. But I will argue that having a conceptual map of the world in your head that you carry around with you allows you to understand things instantly without looking at your phone. Here's a true story. No shitter, as they say in the Navy. I had a student in my naval history course who might have been a candidate for Jay Leno's show. I was discussing a naval event, cannot now even remember which one, but I had occasion to ask, well, where did that happen? And she looked at me rather quizzically and said, in the ocean. I said, which ocean? And then she looked at me like I was maybe a little slow, and said, well, there's the land, and there's the ocean, and it happened in the ocean. So history may be about chaps, but I hope that our students can put those chaps in a specific location, or at least in the right ocean, if they are called upon to defend the Taiwan Straits or participate in a conflict in the Black Sea, to escort, who knows, grain ships out through the Bosphorus. It's helpful to know where that is. So those are the three areas I encourage you to at least think about as you put your naval history courses together. Context. You can never have too much context to embed events, personalities that invite them to put themselves in the shoes of decision makers, and then geographical literacy. Now, in my time left, I hope I have some time left, I know this afternoon we're going to talk about pedagogy and about how to do things, but let me maybe try to preempt a little of that by making some suggestions here. First, most of your students are pretty smart. They probably got A's in high school, and many of them got those A's because they could hear things and remember them and repeat them. They probably never had to take notes in class. Some of them will still be able to do that in college. But I told all of my students, I expect you to take notes. Many of them will do that on laptops now. Some of them still do it on spiral binders. Either one is fine with me. But I required them to take notes. And when they came in for what is called EI, extra instruction at the Naval Academy, usually after they got their first D+ they'd ever gotten in their lives on an exam, I asked, could I see your notes? And guess what? Those with the D+ hadn't taken notes. Now here's a trick to note-taking if you've never done it before and they don't really know how to do it. Some will try to write down everything that's said in the classroom. Can't do that either. Don't try to write it all down. Get the key words and then leave spaces either on the screen or in the notebook so you can flesh that out later. Here's the next tip. Even those students who do take notes, when they leave your classroom on their way to calculus or chemistry or the practice field, they often put their notebook away and don't take it out again until your next class. That's wrong. The way to cement what happened in class on any given day is for them to spend 10 minutes, and it won't take more than 10 minutes, to look at their notes at night, to fill in those blank spaces, to remember the context. Oh yeah, that was about this thing, and then write it in. Having done it again that night reinforces it in their heads. Since many of your students will have little or no experience in taking notes, they might need to be told this first day. Writing. We heard this morning a lot of people who assign writing. I heard from several that they assign a research paper. Great. Research papers are a wonderful way to embed yourself in a naval history topic. But if you're teaching freshmen, or as we call them here, plebes, it's useful for them to have more than one bite at the apple. So I encourage you to at least think about giving them 3 5-page papers, 4 3-page papers. If they bomb the first one, life will go on. If they bomb the research paper, you say, well, you really should have done it some other way. Too late. So I think particularly for first-year students, I would encourage multiple bites at the apple. You might give a short one as a kind of diagnostic and then a research follow-on, but more than one opportunity. Quizzes. I loved what Bill Trimble, where's Bill? Right? I love what Bill Trimble said about quizzes. I know it's considered to be kind of old school, but Bill and I are old school, to give quizzes, but it does focus their reading. I tried to give one at least once a week. You said every other week. That'll work too. And we did it pretty much the same way, apparently. I would come into class, I'd put 5 items on the board from that day's reading. Take out a piece of paper, pick 3 of those 5, and give me an ID response. What is it? 2 points. Why does it matter? 3 more, total of 5. 15 points available on each quiz day. And I'll tell you why this works. Because it takes 10 minutes out of your 50, and then you collect the papers, and then you say, okay, what did you put down for this one? 24 hands go straight up into the air because they want to know if they got it right. I said this. Oh, is that right? Well, what did you put? And it will emerge into a class discussion about the 5 items, events, people that you put on the board. And if you pick the right 5, it covers the class. I have gone into class with a 3x5 card with 5 names on it, and those are my total class notes. I put them on the board, collected the papers, and we had a great discussion. Happened to you too? Pretty much the same way. Quizzes, they're really great. I'm all for it. I also would urge you that if you do this, get those back the next day, because this is a diagnostic for both of you. Number one, they learn that knowing what it is worth 2, and knowing why that matters is worth more than that. They can apply that lesson to the big exam when it comes up, and it's a diagnostic for you. You'll find out that 2/3 of your students thought this was some other thing. That's on you, right? So now you have to get up and say, all right, if you put this down, I didn't mark you down for that because so many of you got it wrong. Let's get it right. What is it? And then you can fill in that blank space. I also think it's a measuring stick in terms of the responsibility of getting material back to them quickly. This applies to both the writing assignment and the quizzes. We expect them to be prompt. We should be prompt in return in getting that back. So that's my pitch. Some ideas about substantive elements that probably should be included, a few suggestions about pedagogy, and I hope it was useful to you, and thanks for the opportunity. Anybody want to know anything about Chester Nimitz? Yeah, right. I've got a book for you. Yeah.
Who was his wife? And how did she influence his career?
Yeah, Catherine Nimitz was a great influence on Chester. And your point is well taken. The implied question of that is well taken. To look at an individual in his entire context, or her entire context, it's necessary to know something besides what's his operational decision-making process. I mean, that's important, right? Nimitz had a thing he called calculated risk. How do we calculate how much risk is appropriate for a particular benefit? But who is he? What are the broad parameters of his life? Family life is one of those things. He was very close to his wife, Catherine, and what makes it great to write about him is they wrote each other every day for 1,351 days of World War II. Now, sadly, Catherine burned about 40 to 50% of those before any historian could get his hands on them, but the rest have survived. And they're in the Naval History and Heritage Command. I'm going to tweak you a bit because they're called the Nimitz Diary. It's not really a diary, it's an epistolary diary, if you would. But someone misspelled it on the box. You might check this when you get back. And it actually says Nimitz Dairy on the box in the Naval History and Heritage Command. But your point's well taken. Yeah.
So, Professor, I was going to approach you after and tell you the story, but I'm a class of '99 grad with BJ. Wherever he's gone, I'm a poli-sci major, but I took your naval atlas with me on deployments. And so as we go to the Arabian Gulf or, throughout the East Coast, I'd always have that with me. And I'd show my division, I'd show the other junior officers, and it was such a great way to tie the history to what we were doing. So
Great.
I really want to thank you for that, and for all of you that will be teaching in the future, that's the kind of influence you have on those of us who went out to the fleet.
Yeah, more questions like that, please. Thank you. Appreciate that. Anybody else? About naval history or about teaching naval history? Either one. Nope. Oh, a ringer. Yes.
It's a ringer. No, Craig, I just want to compliment you on, because one of the things that you did is this consolidated history U.S. Navy. It's a short book.
Oh, the little one.
The little one. And basically, I think the technique, which when I was here, I guess 2 or 3 years ago, was to give that book out and sign it and have the midshipmen read it before like the second week, and that way they're able to get the content.
Did BJ tell you that? He told me. Is he gone? Did he leave? There he is. BJ told me when that book first came out, he said, this is how I'm going to use it. I'm going to say, read the whole history in this little tiny short book, and then we'll go into depth in the various topics and go through. And I guess that works. That isn't why I did it, but I'm glad it worked.
So it actually goes to one of your comments earlier during your talk, and that is what I discovered in my first semester was a very inconsistent knowledge of American history.
Right.
Amongst students. We needed a common grounding to start somewhere. And so by using the concise history book, which is 116 pages, we could, in 2 weeks of readings, set a common starting point. And I have found it to be pretty successful.
Good.
Now I say that, you might want to ask Ensign Willis over here, who was one of my plebes, whether she thought it worked or not. But it
Careful what you say.
does provide a starting point anyway for common context.
Yeah, I found that too in terms of, back to the context again, that I had to find out as I went that there were elements of American history that were just a complete lacuna to a number of who were bright students. You can be bright and ignorant. Those are not mutually exclusive. So providing some common starting area, here's an era, the Federalist era, whatever it might be, is useful before you then begin to talk about ships of the line versus gunboats. To what end? To what purpose? In what environment? Yeah.
Professor Symonds, with
Yep.
respect, regarding the map quizzes, so I spent a long time as a teaching assistant in graduate school.
Yeah.
And several professors at the University of Alabama would agree with you completely and totally about the value of map quizzes, but I was the one that had to grade all the damn things.
Yeah.
So, for very practical and albeit admittedly selfish reasons, I don't assign map quizzes because I think the last thing I would need or want at the beginning of the semester is a stack of quizzes to go through. So what I did, or what I tried to do throughout the semester, is make sure there are maps available on the screen that they can look at. Now, my question is, sorry, that was a very long preface question, is putting maps on the screen for them to look at to provide a context to your lecture. Is that effective or as effective?
It's better than nothing.
Okay.
One of the things I often did, we had whiteboards in our classroom now. When I first started here, they were green chalkboards and actual chalk. And one of the ways you punish midshipmen is you took one of those erasers and you threw it at his navy blue uniform, and he was ruined for the rest of the day. But a whiteboard, you can project onto that whiteboard a map and then actually draw on it and make connections. That's great. That's useful. I did it. I'm all in favor. I still think giving a map, and they don't have to be elaborate. You give an outline map out to everybody. You put, whatever number of items either on the board or on a piece of paper, and put the number 1 here, put the number 2 here, put the number 3 here. They don't take long to grade, and you'll find out that none of the people studying the Civil War know where the Mississippi River is. And that's something worth knowing. So I'm yes, that's good. That's absolutely good.
Quizzes are better.
Quizzes are necessary, in my opinion. Anybody else? We're done. Oh, yeah, sorry, yes.
So I know most of today's focusing on the classroom as the place to educate people, but I was wondering if you might be able to comment on how you might go about educating members of the wider public, members of Congress, people who probably have a lot of different reasons for why they may or may not want to be listening to you in the first place.
I don't know how to tell members of Congress to pay attention and wake up. If you got an idea, let me know. No, that's a great question. Educating the broader community is important. We do what we can, and I do what I can. I've been retired. This is a terrifying number. I've been retired from here for 17 years. And in that time, I spend a lot of time, we'll do field trips to battlefields or to historic ships or to organizations that invite me to come speak. Sometimes they're book clubs, sometimes they're the Navy League, but I will accept opportunities when I can and use that as an opportunity to educate. But mostly that's preaching to the choir. People don't sign up for the Navy League. People don't sign up to go on a field trip to a battlefield unless they already have an interest in it. And how to get people who believe that history is just dead people, I don't know. I don't know how to overcome that. But I try to personally involve myself with non-classroom educational opportunities. And of course, if you're a classroom teacher, you can in fact take advantage of those things yourself. It's not always easy, especially at a place like the Naval Academy, to get permission to go visit a wreck site or an historic ship or a battlefield. When I taught the Civil War here, I took my midshipmen to the battlefield at Gettysburg every fall. And for them, it was far better than a textbook. I mean, their eyes would get as big as saucers when they stood on Little Round Top, having read Killer Angels, to stand where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain yelled, "Bayonets!" So I guess that's the best answer I can give you to that. Did I see a hand move? All right then. Thank you very much, everybody.